hope you're all doing great this wonderful morning. How many of you went out yesterday? How many of you are hungover right now as we speak? I'm proud of you. Thanks for coming. I'm not sure if I would have, so I appreciate you making the effort so much. So, welcome to Economics from the Margins. We're Decolonising Economics, and my name is Noni, and Guppy also. And also, side note, we put out some stickers just on the table, on the chairs. So if you want a sticker, just take one, it's yours. But yeah, we're Decolonising Economics, and today we're going to be exploring the topic of economics from the margins. And I'm joined by three amazing speakers and people who do amazing work that I'm so excited to be sharing this panel with. I'll just introduce them a little bit and then they'll tell you a bit more about themselves later on. So, to my left, I have June Bellobon. June is a writer, event producer, and community organizer. Their work centers around trans liberation with a specific interest in Indigenous Southeast Asian trans identities. They founded and run a Queer Good Grief, a peer support group by and for bereaved LGBTQ+ people, as well as working as a trans mentor for Spectra. They're involved in wealth redistribution projects with We Exist London and Black Unicorn Fund. Black Unicorn Co-op Fund. When not working, they can be found dancing and serving looks in grotty basements and nightclubs until the early hours of the morning. All around London. So that's June. And then to my far left, I have Last. Last Mafuba is a community builder. She supports people of colour overcome challenges of integration. She established Inini Initiative in response to the challenges she faced while trying to integrate into a new community when she first arrived in the UK, and the process she went through until she came to a point where she was happy and settled. Many people of colour face similar challenges, and these impact negatively on their mental and general well-being. Unfortunately, they're not able to access the support they need, and their first contact with mental health services is through the criminal justice system, owing to a host of unresolved barriers. At Inini, Last's work tackles the root of institutional racism and its consequences for those experiencing mental health problems. She provides a safe space for POC to meet and connect while engaging in conversation on issues they find challenging in a weekly support group. And Last will tell us a bit more about that later, but that's really exciting to hear. And then lastly, we've got Hannah from the Classworks project. So we're supposed to have another person here called Dot, but Dot's ill, so shout out to Dot and hope that they get well soon. But they are members of the Classwork project, a 4-person workers cooperative which battles class stigma across the UK. They do this in 3 ways: through independent publishing and media, known widely as lumpen, through pedagogic practices often taking on the form of workshops, consultations, and lastly through the redistribution of resources from those who have capital to those who have less. Through these practices, they aim to embolden those from economic margins in the pursuit of social, cultural, and economic revolution. Can I just get a bit of a pre-clap? A lot of the time when we hear about economics, it tends to come from, I don't know, men in suits, and they'll tell you about GDP, they'll tell you about competition, and they'll tell you how, capitalism is going to win because it is the only way. But is that true? I don't know if it is. And so when we were thinking about this session, and a lot of the work that we do at Decolonising Economics is kind of thinking about the stories of the economy and why we hear those stories of the economy. So why do we hear that there's nothing we can do about the economy? Why do we hear that the economy is just like this kind of magical floating thing that's kind of rational, does what it wants, but does it do what it wants, or is it a system that was designed? And so when we think about, we started this project because we work with so many amazing people who are thinking about how wealth was created and working to readdress the imbalances that has created over history. And so, this is not a diversity and representation platform. Rather, it's to highlight the stories of the economy which are steeped in ideas of domination, competition, efficiency, and speculation. And thinking about how this is specifically a political project that dates back to the 14th century, where wealth owners, bankers, and slave trades were given the means and the power to define economic tools, like how we have the stock exchange that directly relates back to slavery. And how we have infrastructure like banks. Many of the banks that exist today actually came about because of slavery, like Barclays and stuff. And like the relationships that we hold in our current economy, those which are around like the worker and the exploited, and the way that those are recreated across different contexts and across different nations as well. And so, and like also when we think about the ecological crisis and the relationships that kind of led to that, we have to take it back to the 14th century. And so, we like to start our sessions with by quoting Suhaima Manzoor Khan, who's also known as the Brown Hijabi, who says to decolonize is to contextualize. And it reminds me of this African proverb, and I once heard this joke that anyone who says something is an African proverb, is it an African proverb? But I'm going to say it. This African proverb, which states, if you know the beginning, the end will not surprise you. And I think with much of the symptoms of a broken economic system, we can kind of get to the roots of them when we think with this idea of contextualizing the economy. So when we decolonize, we can question the ways in which under the economy, trans people, women, children, poor people, disabled people, displaced people, people of color are routinely exposed to state violence in order for the state and the economy to function. And the story that capitalism tells us is that that is the only way, right? That, that's just how it is. There's people we exploit and there's people who get the benefits of that exploitation. And and like we get all these individualist narratives which say that people suffer because of X, Y, Z, when actually is a design in the system that was made to deny specific people with agency, security, and autonomy. And that again is a historic project. So, one more thing, economy directly translates to the meaning, so it means the management of home. So when we think about our home as in nature or our home as in the way in which we relate to our bodies, because our bodies are our homes, right? How is it under the current economic system are we taught to relate to our bodies and our homes, right? And in the current economic, I think it's like Gautam Bhattacharya says that in our collective home, the integrity and the walls of the house depend on their on the denial of some specific people's access to the home, right? And access to feeling safe in our bodies. And what happens when your safety and autonomy and agency are made redundant and useless to the whims of the state market? And when we talk about and so this talk is thinking about that, the story of expansion of slavery and colonialism and how it filters down to the different intersections of our experiences and how that kind of relates to the development of the capitalist system. And one more thing, so we're really interested in this session to think about how, if you exist outside the home, how do you subvert or how do you survive, right, in an economic system which is predicated on your death, right, and your displacement? How have communities of color and how have those communities on the margins have created survival mechanisms to exist outside of the story of capitalism? And also, when we think that there is no story of the economy that is complete without those that have resisted it for centuries and centuries, but rarely do we hear those stories, right? And so I wanted to kind of give you a term that we like to use, which is like liberatory economics / solidarity economics. And these represent the practices and that these hold the practices that offer the real solutions to economic and ecological crisis. Solutions which center relationships with the land rooted in care, mutuality, solutions which redefine labor relations as equitable, communal, and reciprocal, and solutions which ensure each member of society can be cared for and looked after. That sounds nice, right? Pretty cute. And so we're going to hear from our amazing speakers about how they deal with this or how they understand the economic system and how it impacts those who they work with, and they can tell us more about their work. So I'm going to pass over to them to tell us a bit more about what they're doing. So, June, last, Hannah, tell us, please introduce your work and how it speaks on the theme of economics on the margins.
Yeah, hey everyone. Yeah, I think if I had to think of, I guess, like the economic projects I'm involved with, I think first of all, when you said like, oh, how do you understand economics? I was just like, I don't at all. Which is, I think, kind of like the point, you know what I mean? Which is why I think this session is so exciting, because I think there's a reason why the financial system, the economic system is so inaccessible and uses language that most people don't understand, and like, just like, you know, I don't know, what is the stock market? You know what I mean? We don't know on purpose, I feel, because it's convenient for people not to know so that the people in power can stay in power. Anyways, that's not the point. But yeah, as far as economic projects I'm involved with, I guess like the thing that I'm working specifically towards is you know, financial stability for queer and trans people. So I co-ran a hardship fund in 2020 when COVID happened, which was specifically for Black and brown queer people. I think we saw, kind of like as soon as COVID happened, just like our community, we just saw like people just like lose their jobs all of a sudden, people having their housing threatened all of a sudden, and receiving no support from the state, especially people that didn't hold like British citizenship or that had like asylum, you know, issues. And so we, and I think like, you know, COVID brought forward mutual aid on a much like larger scale than it had before. And so this was like a mutual aid project that it was just set up by, you know, 4 or 5 friends that kind of just saw their community lose very basic things that they shouldn't lose. And we, managed to raise over 90K and redistribute funds to over 350 people in the UK. But I think I think which was fab, and like it was way more than like any of us anticipated. But I think if I think about, you know, economics and money, this was also, I think like, mutual aid, as I said, kind of like became more of a thing during COVID, and also you had, I think it's like, I hate that wealth redistribution becomes a thing only when there's a tragedy happening, and like, you know, George Floyd happened in 2020, and we saw like, you know, we were getting like thousands of pounds a day after that happened, and it kind of made you think like, oh, so this wealth was around the entire time. Now people just feel guilty enough to give it, which was pretty, I don't know, it was like such like a bittersweet thing of being like, oh, we're getting loads of money, which is fab, but also people, it kind of just like brought to the surface that like people don't actually have to struggle the way they do, because actually there was enough money for everyone to, you know, be fine, which is like, we knew, but I think it was like very like obvious, you know, just like it became very obvious. And the other project I'm involved with is I co-run a trans grassroots organization called We Exist. And I think that looks specifically at healthcare for trans people. I think there's a myth that in this country we have free healthcare, and I think trans people don't have free healthcare. I think if we did, we wouldn't have to wait 5 years for a first appointment, which is the current waiting time for anyone that is referred to the gender identity clinic. It's like a severely underfunded sector. It's also like a really humiliating medical process that people have to do, where they have to do psychiatric tests and, you know, prove to usually only cisgender doctors about the validity of their gender to have any form of like, medical support. And so We Exist is again like a mutual aid wealth redistribution project where we give money into trans people looking to access healthcare who don't have the funds. And that's kind of like running constantly. And I think like one thing that I'm gonna say about it is also I think it's a lot of the time people that do this work, that do like care work and mutual aid work, are actually in a position of scarcity themselves. and actually the founder of We Exist, who was a trans woman who waited years to be seen by the GIC, took her own life earlier this year, before she had her first appointment. And so, she set up this organization to support all of these trans people, and then wasn't actually receiving the support herself. And I think, I also want us to rethink the way we think about, like, when we talk about, trans people being, like, proximity to death, I think, like, a lot of the time the focus is, them being killed in the streets, and actually, to me, a trans person's suicide a lot of the time is, like, murder by the state, and that was definitely the case for the founder of We Exist. They don't want us to thrive, and they don't want us to survive, because we are a threat to the system. Yeah, that's it.
Right, are we going in order? Start out. Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm part of the Classwork project, as you said. I also don't really know anything about economics, but apparently my job is economics, largely. The Classwork project, pretty much everything that we do is about kind of extracting resources back from the upper classes and bringing them back to the working class, or the kind of more marginalised people. So with Lumpen, which is a thing that I started with Dee Hunter, who I think you know, it started as a way of like trying to kind of gather different kinds of disparate voices that were economically marginalised. So not just like, so Dee Hunter, he wrote this book called Child Solidarity, and this book became quite famous within leftist movements, and he decided that he didn't want to be like one of the only kind of main voices of like kind of the working class narrative, especially as like a cis white man. So we decided to put together this book, or like this journal called Lumpen, and it was supposed to be one thing with like lots of different writers from like, people from various movements, like leftist movements. And then it turned into a magazine, and that magazine is on, I think, the 9th issue now, and it comes out every 3 months. And with this journal, we encourage and support people who've never written before, so people from kind of the economic margins, to have a political voice and to write various kind of nuanced, kind of to get thoughts out that are related to class, but also related to various other things. Like we have often writers who write about mental health or drugs or kind of trans identity or gender in other ways, or like it's very, very, very broad, and sometimes a little bit too broad because you have no idea what's in each issue. It's just chaotic. And we also have poetry, and like some of the pieces, like one piece, I think in the first issue really stuck out to me. Like it's really like kind of stayed with me, and that's called The Poverty of Knowledge, and it's something that I think a lot about in terms of what it means to be poor. And what this article talks about a lot is being time poor, that like working class jobs take all of your time to the point where you have nothing left to give. You have no time to be creative, you have no time to have hobbies, you have no time to participate in political organising at all, because you're just working 3 jobs, or you're working night shifts and you're exhausted. So I guess in that sense, how that relates to, I think like how Lumpen in general relates to economics is the fact that it's independent, it's financially and economically independent from any kind of like huge organisation. We fully fund it ourselves. But then a lot of the things that come up in that are also about time, and with Lumpen we pay authors to make some time for themselves, to have some time for themselves, to actually think about these things. So it's a lot of the time it's about time and giving that space to people. So that's one part of the project. There's about two other bits that we do. The other bit is we do pedagogic practices. Posh word, I could just say we like teach people. Sorry. But so we do like various workshops, and they're usually about 2 days long, and I call them hazing rituals because they're terrifying. And that's often where you get like, we do them for like all kinds of different movements, and we've done them for like housing co-ops, we've done them for like radical roots, and we've done them for like counselling groups, and like we've done it for like lots of different organisations. And in those 2 days, what tends to happen is we kind of sort people out in terms of their capitals, and what kind of privileges they hold and what kind of capitals they hold, and that could be social, cultural, and economic, or economic in terms of money. And what we often find in those kind of movements is that there's people who are very low in capital, or like historically low in capital. Maybe, you know, their parents, their grandparents never had any money, never had any kind of cultural capital, never had anything that kind of gave them a leg up or gave them some sort of safety net. But there were many other people who had large amounts of wealth, but this wasn't being talked about in their movements or in their households or in the work that they were doing. So that two-day space was about kind of getting to the bottom of what this disparity in wealth was, like what kind of tensions this disparity in wealth was causing within that movement, and how that can be fixed, I guess, or how that can be reconciled in some way amongst that group. So often what happens after 2 days is that there's kind of problem solving session, and often what comes out of that is that people decide to redistribute wealth, whether that's like their time wealth, like the amount of time they have, or whether that's like the financial capital they have, or like various other things. And so they're often quite fruitful, and we've not had a bad one yet. We did have one person write a blog about us saying that we were clearly just trying to seek revenge for our childhood traumas, but you know, that's neither here nor there, and kind of true, to be honest. But yeah, so how does that relate to economics? Well, it completely just does. It just, we redistribute wealth. And the third thing that we do is, we redistribute wealth. And especially over lockdown, like as you said, a lot of people lost their jobs, a lot of people got fines for COVID. Like a lot of people became poorer over lockdown. It's just the facts. It was like pretty immense. So we ended up redistributing, because we were already like redistributing wealth through like the workshops that we were doing, and like that was kind of, we were known for doing that. We ended up redistributing, I think, like 250 or 300,000 pounds over lockdown, over the first or second lockdown, which was a ridiculous amount of money, which terrified us and was not good. But a lot of that money came from people who came to our workshops and knew the kind of work that we were doing, and often that just went immediately to whoever needed it first. So it would be like, maybe it was a fine that someone couldn't pay, or maybe it was to put food in people's fridges because people couldn't afford to buy food, or like paying off debt. Like with some of that money I paid off my mother's debt, and my mother had been barricading herself in her own home for the last 2 years, and that was incredibly important for me to be able to offer that to her, offer someone else's money to her. So yeah, that's what I do with 3 other people.
Hi, sorry to interrupt. Can I just ask that the speakers speak as close to the microphone as possible, because we're competing with the HGVs on the road outside.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. I know you two were talking about your work, but I just don't know how to follow that, even though I am talking about my work. Economics. Just saying that word gives me a lot of anxiety. And I work with refugee migrant communities, supporting them to overcome the challenges of integration, which usually induces mental health problems. So my main focus is on mental health. It's difficult to talk about finance and economics with the group that I support. This is the group where if the government is supporting you, you're getting £35 a week. That's your allowance. And most of them have got no recourse to public funds, which means they don't earn anything. So we do a peer support group. At one point, I asked one guy to come and talk about investment to the group. Yeah, people were interested, but it was painful to watch. These are people with nothing, completely nothing. These are people who have to decide whether to eat that day or pay for transport to get to their solicitor. they just don't earn anything. So when we talk about economics, I think they don't participate in the economic field at all. If they have status and are able to work, there's a lot of barriers and challenges they face that restrict them getting into work. And sometimes you don't have the right status to go to work, but sometimes you just try and you do it anyway. But there's a lot of risk in it, and the money that you earn is not enough to even look after you. Most of them are homeless. It is only when the pandemic hit that they were put in hotels. But these are people who usually are just roaming the streets. They don't have anywhere to go. We used to have a night shelter where they could go in just for the night, but they have to leave the shelter by 8 o'clock in the morning. So they spend the day roaming the streets. They sit in the library, but when you're trying to doze off in the library, you are kicked out of the library. Most of them have experienced mental health problems, have been detained under the Mental Health Act, but they still get released back into homelessness. And because they are homeless, taking the medication whilst on the street leaves them vulnerable. So in the end, they disengage. And their mental health deteriorates. They relapse. They go back into hospital. And the hospital door becomes a revolving door where they are either in or out. And most of the time, they end up getting their status. But by the time they get their status, they are so ill they can't even afford to work. So they just have a mental health problem. They can't recover from it. They try to manage it, to live with it, but still it's difficult because there's no support. People of color are 4 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. They are 8 times more likely to be released on a community order, community treatment order. And what happens is, I'm saying this because I sit on the Coventry and Warwickshire Partnership Trust, where we are consulting to see why Black people are overrepresented in experiencing mental health issues. There is evidence to show that once they go back into the community, and they're supposed to have a community worker work with them, the mental health professionals deem they are too dangerous to visit whilst they are in the community. So that no one supports them once they get back into the community. So my work is to advocate for people. Like you've been in a hospital, you come out, you're on the streets. Section 117 is supposed to kick in when the government is supposed to support you, whether you have status or not. But most of the people I work with don't know that. And the hospitals don't tell them. They just release them. And they are not even ashamed. They will put on their record that they were released into homelessness. So my work is to advocate for them to get accommodation, to make sure they continue to engage with treatment. I work with people to give them information on what services are available to them and how those services can be accessed. We have a counseling therapist who offers one-to-one psychological coaching, and we also do have workshops where we teach them, we create awareness of mental health. We talk to them about what they can do once they are experiencing stuff like anxiety, depression, and when they have suicidal thoughts. We also do have what we call a food therapy, This is a peer support group that meets every Tuesday, and on that on that day, we make traditional meals where people come in, because most of them, because they are homeless, they haven't been to their homes in years. The next best thing for them to be closer to home is coming together, eating their cultural food, their traditional food, and probably finding one or two people who they can speak to in their own language. And that has been very successful, because once people sit and eat and going through the support group, they relax. So it's easier to talk to them about difficult topics such as mental health. People then open up because they are more relaxed. Some people may think food is not really important. About 2 weeks back, I received a call from one guy. I'd never met him, but during the lockdowns, I was making traditional meals in my kitchen and distributing to the hotels where these people were being accommodated. So he rang me and said to me, I don't have any food, I'm not well. So I went out to see him. And I said to him, you're living in a good place, and the organization that you're telling me that they've put you here, there's no way they can leave you here with no food. So he said to me, come with me to the kitchen. We went to the kitchen and he opened his cupboard. There was the cupboard was full of pasta and canned food and the like. So people would say, but he had food. He doesn't eat that kind of food. He doesn't understand that kind of food. He wanted traditional meals, the food that he knows. And this guy had been in hospital because he'd attempted suicide. But I'm happy now he's on the mend and he's engaging, and he's now joining the peer support group, which is quite helpful. So in a nutshell, I think there's a lot that I could say, but in a nutshell, this is what I do. And probably just to say, the people that I work with do not participate in anything economic at all.
Thank you so much to all of you for sharing about the work that you do. And I feel like, you know what you were saying last about who can participate in the economy and what does that look like, right? And I think especially with ideas, I really liked it when you were talking about food, because food and the economy are so inextricably linked, you know? Me and Last are from Zimbabwe, and in Zimbabwe there's a huge whole, oh god, I just scratched my makeup, but there's a whole thing about seed taxes and like food justice, and like the types of food you can have, where you can have food, is something which is really, 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 really related to our experiences of the economy. Because, you know, I feel like all of you talked about the basic needs, right? And those needs are so important for people to live, right? For people to be able to access healthcare, for people to be able to not be like laden with debt, for people to be able to be safe and to have like therapy and support. Those basic needs, I feel like when we talk about the economy, are often forgot. You know, the ideas that people need food can, you know, like when you ever watch Parliament, remember when they voted about the school meals thing, and apparently it was just like, people could not understand why children need to eat. And I was like, well, it's so simple. Everyone needs to eat, right? And I really appreciate the things that you have all brought up, and it kind of makes me think about what are the ideas, right, and the narratives that justify, or like how do you see the ideas and narratives that justify this state-sanctioned suffering and dispossession and, you know, hunger? What are the what are the narratives and ideas that we're told that about, like, yeah, do you know what I mean? You know what I mean. What narratives? Why? I don't know who wants to answer first, so I just put it. Yeah. Okay, let me say the question again. I actually wrote it down, so let me just read it. I don't know why I was trying to riff. Okay. So how is the exploitation, dispossession, displacement inherent to the economy being justified and furthered by dominant and current economic thought and practice. But then maybe ignore the economic bit. So, but yeah, how are we told that these people deserve to suffer, basically, by the state? Would anyone like to answer?
I mean, yeah, I think it's kind of wild when you think about, like, you know, the way this country treats trans people, because I think, like, transness is treated as a disease in a lot of ways. Like, you need to go through, like, psychiatric, you know, evaluations, and it's, like, heavily medicalized, and, you know, all of these things. But then it's also very much not, but it's also treated as a luxury at the same time. So, which kind of, yeah, it's so, yeah, I don't know. It's just so, it doesn't make any sense, basically. Because it's this idea that, like, oh yes, there's a medical condition that you need to, you know, have an appointment for, and, like, be treated by medical professionals. But then, like, I cannot name any other medical condition that you're expected to live with for 5 years before you get seen by a doctor, and even then, probably not treated. Yeah, so I think there's this idea that, like, you know, trans people are, like, asking for more, and, like, just being, I don't know, like, low, I don't know, just being, like, require a lot, when actually it's, like, a very basic thing that we're asking for. And it's like, oh, if you're asking for gender to be medicalized, then you also need to treat it as such, and you need to treat it with urgency. But I think I was thinking, you know, yesterday when I was at, like, the Sarah Everett talk, when they were talking about, you know, the whole system is faulty and we need to change it. And I think, like, the reason why I was saying earlier, like, you know, trans people are a threat, and by that I mean, you know, we are handed a system, like the one of gender, we are handed a system like our body, and this idea of, like, sex and bodies, and we reject that and we reinvent that. And I think people are shook by that. I think, like, people in power are really shook by the idea of just, like, us rejecting something that has been so fixated and that is so, you know, overpowering society. And I think people are really, like, fearful of, like, losing their privilege and losing their power. And I think, like, trans liberation will bring that, will bring a rethinking of power and all of these things. So I think that's why we're in a position of scarcity, because I think if we weren't, things would, like, shake the fuck up. Yeah.
So I was thinking as well earlier, I forgot to prefix it, but under, like, colonialism, you know, the idea is that there were some people who are innately inferior, right? So they just have all this land, and because they're inferior, we're just going to take it, you know? They're uncivilized, so we're just going to take their stuff. Women are crazy, so we're going to lock them away, you know? Like, those ideas, and I feel like you really touched on that, just like those accepted thoughts of, like, inferiority and who's important and who's got autonomy as well. But I just a little ad lib.
Thank you. I think for the group that I work with, that's asylum seekers and refugees, the Parliament passed the hostile environment policy in 2017. So deliberately, they are being nasty to anyone who's coming into this country to seek sanctuary. So they go back. And the justification is they are not meant to be here. But if we really look deeper, I'll go with the colonialism that you've talked about. Most people end up moving to this country because of the destabilizations in their own countries. And these are usually caused by countries in the north. They go there, they take people's land, they move them from here to there, they promise them development, and that development doesn't happen. And what it does is it just makes the rich richer and the poor poorer, and it creates the, what do we call, okay, it just creates this thing where the richer become so powerful that the poorer, they can't even challenge them. And when they try and challenge the richer, they are silenced, they are killed, and they run to the UK, for example, for support. And then the UK is saying, no, you have to go back. People with no recourse to public funds for the past 4 or 5 years, have not been able to access health. They can't access it until recently when the COVID vaccine came into play, because they want them to be vaccinated. And not because they don't want them to catch COVID, but because people want to protect themselves. Because if they are not vaccinated, they will get ill, and if they are ill, they will continue passing on the virus to other people. And sadly, the amnesty to access health is now there, but detention centers have been opened and people have started to be sent back home. They've started deporting people. So what's happening is, even if you want to access health and you are now able to do so, you've been living under the radar for a couple of years, no one knows where you are, so you're just living your life. Now if you have to go and register with your GP, you're going to leave your contact details with the GP, and they're going to come and get you and deport you. So it's a lose-lose situation where even if I want the vaccine, I can't go for the vaccine because I don't want to be deported back to a place where someone is waiting to kill me. It's just a lose-lose situation for them.
I'm trying to figure out how to answer this question in a way that, like, both of you touched on so many things that I wanted to talk about. One of which, the rich get richer and they become all-consumingly powerful, and you can't fight them. There's nothing that you can do. So I think that we're going to talk about that at some point later. Like, what can you do in that situation? But I mean, the people I work with are people who are economically marginalised. They're people who've been told all of their lives that they're worthless and they're not worth anything and they're deserving of their poverty. This is like a completely felt, internalized way of being when you're poor. That's just how it works. And we live in a society where, we have the upper class, we have the billionaires, the millionaires, and we have like a middle class. And this middle class are essentially the working class who've managed to kind of accrue some sort of capital, and therefore they're better than the working class who've never managed to own property, never managed to buy a house, never managed to get gainful employment. So what you're seeing is that we have this strata in society where we have like the working class, like poor people who are kind of living in their shite, I don't know, well, there's hardly any council houses left now, but they're like badly, overpriced, rented accommodation somewhere, who are working like 3 jobs, who are working like doing tertiary labour, jobs that often are meaningless and shouldn't really exist. And then you've got like a middle class who are gainfully employed, who are meaningfully participating in the world that is seen as valued and recognised as something that's valued. And like with this, I completely lost my train of thought. So with this, what you're kind of constantly seeing is that the entire system, the entire capitalist system, the class system which also is propagated by racism, by patriarchy, by all kinds of different oppressions, is reproduced through the way in which we relate to each other. It's reproduced through these value systems. It's reproduced through like this idea of being middle class, being respectable, being someone who is deserving of the things that they've accrued through their life. But what that actually does is that is a treachery, and it completely throws working class people under the bus, because what essentially the middle class people are doing is like looking like for aspirational wealth, looking at the upper class, looking at the things that they have, and completely ignoring the roots from where we came from, like where middle class people came from. We're not looking back, and we're not pulling each other up. We're not supporting each other. So yeah, I guess like kind of wrap that part up. I think like what I'm trying to say there is like a lot of like how the class system operates, or a lot of the ways in which we're kind of essentially fucked by the state is through the social and cultural means, the way in which we relate to each other. So that's a lot of the stuff that we kind of handle and like discuss in the classwork project. How else does it happen? It happens in like, I mean, being poor is really expensive. Like if you can't afford to invest in anything, then you're just buying cheap shoes and cheap clothes and like cars that break down every year, and like it's an exhaustive, you know, not having any means to live by is exhausting, and you're constantly just, you know, like, you know, it's hand to mouth. So yeah, like there's so many different ways that the state, that the kind of economic system as it exists kind of impacts working class people.
Thank you. I really love the different, like just weaving together all of these different experiences and like rooting them in something which is like deeper and like more like it's on purpose, right? And like those narratives exist for a reason. And yesterday, we keep on talking about the Sarah Everard talk because it was good, but yesterday someone said something really interesting at the Sarah Everard talk, which was, they said that consent is more than just sex. It's, you know, when we think about consent, we think that there's so much, there are so many people who are not given the right to consent, right? And that consent might look like, like how we can think about consent and the different like material lives that people live as well. And I've really been thinking about that because it sounds, I don't know, from all the things that you've all been saying, there's people who are not allowed to say no, right? And there's people who are not allowed to stand up, and there's people who are not given, the opportunities to define their own lives, and that's just, it's just like the core function of the system, of the economic system. So, and like, you know, how that is also then propped up by those ideas of inferiority, and you know, how some people can't make decisions for themselves. But then, one thing that we found at Decolonising Economics is through the communities we work with, you know, rewind, and also with the consent and like material experiences, there's also this idea that we need to like dominate as like poor people, as, you know, people in the margins, in order to be like taken seriously, right? So it's like, I'm going to be the CEO of the world and I rose up girl boss, you know, that type of stuff. But you know, when we, you know, like that's a function of the economic system as well. So what are we dominating? Like, why should we dominate in order to succeed? And also, again, it goes back to the things that you were all saying about like the individualistic narratives that blame people for their situations. And it's like, if I worked harder, etc., etc., it's not true. And so I kind of wanted to find out as well, because what we found at Decolonising Economics is that no story of the economic system is complete without the stories of the people that have resisted against it for centuries, right? And also, those stories are made to not exist, right? And are made to be invisibilized. And that serves to continue the reign of capitalism as the only way forward, right? And so what we found like during our work at Decolonising Economics is that there are so many communities who are like subverting and challenging the ideas that what capitalism expects of us, right? Instead of me looking after myself and being the CEO of the world, what if all of us were CEOs of the world, you know? What if it was like a horizontal CEO structure forever, you know? And so I kind of wanted to start thinking about, you know, the ways in which we see like, you know, our communities subverting those ideas of capitalism, and how you've seen, how have you seen people doing that? And like, you know, I think a lot of the time when we talk about economic alternatives, people are like, just socialism, right? But actually socialism isn't the only way, right? Sorry to say that, I know there's that huge banner over there. I know some of you might want to cry right now, but socialism isn't the only way. And I think because socialism is very white bro, so it's given like good kudos, right? But like when we think about like communities of color, so you know, when I was growing up, my grandma used to run like a burial society, which is a cooperative. But then we don't think of that as economic principles, right? Because it's like poor people, I don't know, someone's grandma's doing it, I don't give a fuck. But you know, like what are those, there's so many hidden practices that are purposely hidden in history because they're trying to fuck with us. So I wonder if you've seen any practices, or yeah, how are your communities like subverting this need to kill us all? So I just want to know. I don't know who'd like to take it first.
I will say for the communities that I work with, we run campaigns. We have a right to a home campaign, right to food and right to work campaigns, and we just started. No, it's been going on for a year now. A housing project, a Caraca housing foundation, which is apparently, I just had the day before yesterday, because the report came out on how we designed it and we're now delivering it. That is the first wholly owned, migrant-owned housing foundation in Europe. What we are trying to do is do things our own way and not to depend on other people, because we realize that no matter how much we cry, if they don't understand our language, they don't understand our pains, they don't understand our challenges, it's going to take a long, long time for us to see something. Maybe I would say the challenges that we face as refugee migrant communities do not mean that we don't have any solutions to those challenges. What we lack is power. We lack the power to implement those solutions. So what we're trying to do is see how we can get power to implement solutions that we already have. So that's the first one that we've done. Our house is accommodating 6 people, and we are looking to get another house to accommodate more people with no recourse to public funds. So that's what we've been doing to challenge this. Yeah. And also, I want to add that we hold these campaigns, but what frustrates me is there's a lack of civic participation from the mainstream communities. And because the refugee migrant community is, I think, just 1%, 1 or 4%, I can't remember correctly. Our voices are not heard. We are not loud enough because we are just a very small minority. And we would do better with more civic participation, where people come and join us, and so that our voices are heard when we're trying to challenge the challenges that we're facing. And I know most of the time people would say to you, oh, it's the government. It's the government this, it's the government that. But my thinking is, you voted the government in. Yeah. You can take it out. I look at it as the government is there to do what you are mandating them to do. And if they are not doing what you ask them to do, you call them out. You remove them, you put somebody else in. So in the end, I just think probably the mainstream communities are just not coming out to say, we actually support the government, but we cannot come out to say it straight to you. Because even when we look at how people voted with Brexit, anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, I'd like to take the government out. That would be nice. Yes, alternative economies. Yeah, mostly crime, I say. No, I'm joking. No, but I mean, like, I will come to that at some point. But I would say that, like, a lot of the work that we do is because we are for people from poor and broken backgrounds who were exhausted, and we're kind of participating in lefty politics, but we're often participating with people who did not have our experiences, did not share our language, kind of taking your phrase, and so there was this constant misrecognition happening. We weren't sharing the same ideas, and we weren't sharing the same perspectives on things, and that's often good, except when it's the dominant voices that are kind of taking over, and then the ones who are in the margins, even though maybe they appear socially mobile because they're at this meeting, or they're they're at TWT, or they've gone to university or whatever, they're still in the margins because they're not being seen, they're not being recognised for who they are. So I would say that with Lumpen, and like Lumpen is kind of the publishing arm of the Classwork project, and we do various other things, and we publish other people's work. We've got like 2 chapbooks called what are they called? See What Life Is Like by Dorothy Spencer, who was supposed to be here today, and another one by Jake Hawkey called Breeze Block. So we do various other things, but like those practices, being able to publish people's work, it's a loving project of recognition. It's about really helping to develop a shared language between people who are marginalised and people who aren't. So that. For us, that's a very profoundly important alternative economy, because it's not like we're gonna, there's probably about 3 spaces for like working class voices in Penguin, and they're all gonna be white men. We can't. That's not a reasonable way for us to participate. So how we do participate is by creating alternative means, like alternative methods to do these things, and and this is historical. This is part of like, I would argue to say that I kind of grew up in kind of a more anarchist subculture, and like this, independent publishing has always been part of that. Like the means of owning publishing has been part of leftist culture for 1,000 years. I have no idea how long, but so for us it's like it has its historical legacy, and it's so in that way it's a practice, and it's a tradition. It's a practice of those traditions, but it also has its own real legitimate way of helping us make money for ourselves, but other people who are also marginalised. So it's fucking separate. Like it has nothing to do with Penguin or like other huge publishing houses. We're not very rich because we aren't Penguin, but that's fine. And like, yeah, and so I feel like I'm probably babbling, so I might pass on. Yeah. The crime thing was also about like, so like a lot of the people that we work with, like often like they have to budget in to live relatively well and relatively healthy, often can't afford food, so often steal it. Like there's a lot of kind of alternative economies that exist in kind of poor culture that aren't often legal, and I think we have to start like recognising why that is, and that it is okay when we're living in a system where everything is stolen, the land is stolen from us, the things in the museum are stolen from other places. So why are we judging people from stealing chocolate bars from shops or whatever else they need? So that's something that we often think about. Anyway.
Yeah, I think to me, like alternative economies comes from like a place of like care and compassion, which I see in my community in a way that like I definitely don't see in kind of like, white people in positions of power. For them, it's kind of always like a competition of kind of like who will hold more power and who will like get this promotion and what can I do with my power. And I think with like, when I think about my communities, I feel like that's not how we, I mean, obviously you get backstabbing bitches everywhere. But as a whole, I think there's like a lot more like care and compassion that I see, where it's just like there is a sense of like we're all in this shit together. How can we uplift each other? And yeah, the way I see it is, especially when we think about like historically, for instance, you get for a long time, the only job that like trans women could do was like sex work, and I think like the way the sex workers show care to each other is like can be really special, and you know, the way they keep each other safe when, again, there's like a system actively trying to kill them that doesn't protect them in any way. It's like, yeah, the sisterhood of like, you know, keeping each other safe from clients, from police, and from all of these things, and like thriving is really fab, and I think that's existed for decades, and I think that's really beautiful. I think now, if I'm talking again about like, you know, medical transition, you get a lot of trans people, you know, holding DIY self-medication workshops, which I think, like, again, this is something like some people find really like terrifying. This idea that, like, you know, we'll buy hormones and estrogen and testosterone off the internet and like medicalize ourselves. I think people are just like, the fuck? But it's like, realistically, first of all, that's what people have to do. Second of all, that allows us an autonomy over our body that the system doesn't. But I'm also like so amazed at like trans people gaining this knowledge of being like, you know, it's not doctors, you know, it means like literally like trans people that have everyday job or are unemployed, being like, I have figured out how to do this, and I'm going to share this knowledge with other trans people that need this knowledge. And I think that's really beautiful. So I think there's a more like shared knowledge and a shared care in the like economy of my communities, I guess, that like I think it's really fab, and it's really challenging of our ideas of economics. Yeah.
Thank you. I like to hear all of those things because they make my heart warm, right? Of just like, let's just do it ourselves, because the government doesn't care. They never have. And I really liked what you said last about, like, if people can't hear or understand why you're crying, are they actually invested in supporting you? Because they're obviously not. And I feel like issues of like representation come with this idea that if you explain your struggle, somehow things will change. And I just don't think that, because if that was true, I am sure things would be very different by now. And I think as well, with like lots of people who have wealth and power, that genuine belief that, I don't know, like stories, there's something about like representation and like those material needs that like those two are very, very much linked, and I think about that all the time. And I really like the things that kind of came up as well around when Nas was saying like the solutions, because we hold the solutions and the innovation that is needed to liberate much of the entire world, right? The ideas and solutions that exist in the margins are what are actually needed in these times of crisis. And I think so often it's like, I don't know, some guy in Oxford has written a book and that's what we need. I don't think that's true. It's not practice orientated, it's a bit useless. And so also the things that you were saying about legality as well, because so many of us live outside of the law. I've recently heard about the trespassers law. You know, you can't even go to a park or whatever without getting arrested now, right? So much basic, nice stuff is illegal. And so, I can't remember who said this, but like the idea that law is a means of dispossession, right? The law exists to harm. And so when we think about subverting those places, is legality and law where we start from? I don't know. I'm not saying we should do crime, but maybe. And also the ideas of like compassion and care, because those should be central to any form of organizing relationships within a society, not the afterthought, you know? And that was just a word blurb of summaries. But you know what? We're running a bit behind. We've got one more question, but then I think I'm going to save that one question for the end as a closing remark for the speakers. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 2 minutes to kind of sit with yourselves or with the person next to you and kind of chat about what you've just heard, and then we're going to take questions. Apparently it's not a Q&A, it's a community talk. I learned that yesterday. We're doing a community talk. So 2 minutes to think of a question and things that you would like to ask our speakers, and then, go for it. It sounds like you all have a lot of questions. Would anyone like to drop in a question? Oh, Amy, yeah.
Hi, thank you. That was really great. My question was about, because you're all kind of, I guess, coming from slightly different positions but also from the same perspective, and there was like loads of similarities between what you were saying. And I was wondering if you had any like examples or like ideas or things you wanted to share about how maybe you've been working together, or like ideas you've been sharing together, and like those kinds of things.
Who'd like to start?
Like together between us.
Yeah, or just like how these different positions that you're coming from can like fit together, or projects that you've seen that you think are interesting, or it's quite vague, sorry.
I have an example. So, our wonderful friends at the Solidarity Economics Association recently, I think they're here somewhere? Okay, China's over there. For the last like 4-5 months, we meet with the Solidarity Economics Association, and they've brought together Decolonising Economics, the Classworks project, and more, which is like migrants organized rights and empowerment, and it's so great to I really enjoy those spaces of coming together and like sharing those like shared strategies, because in like economic spaces it tends to be very like separate, but it's nice. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question, but like yeah, those spaces to kind of see where there are like similarities and like to, I don't know, I'm not answering the question, so I'm just going to pass on.
I think like one thing that when we did the COVID like hardship fund for like queer people of color in 2020, I think it was organized between 5 friends who all like lived in London and were kind of like same, kind of type of community. One thing that we're very aware of was the fact that like we probably didn't reach a lot of communities. And I think when you're like a grassroots organization, it's hard to think of like outreach, because first of all, usually you're working from like a unpaid position and like you have limited resources. So it's like the idea of like even expanding and like reaching people that you want to is like quite a hard task. So I think there's something about like so one thing that we did was like part of the funds that we got, we actually just like gave a chunk to grassroots organizations like working around the UK that were working with like queer communities and like queer migrant communities specifically across the UK, and just like gave them some of the funds to be like you a lot more equipped to help those communities that we are, and I think there's something about like sharing the wealth that you have, or like sharing the resources that you have with people that are already doing the work and with people that have that knowledge and have those connections, that is like a lot more helpful than like trying to do everything yourself. Again, I don't know if that answered the question either, but yeah.
I think I'm going to get a little bit more tangential. Yeah, so what was I saying? So what I quite like about, so actually what Nani said, I'm quite sad about this connection that we have through Sion, because I never get to go to the meetings because we're heavy delegators in classwork projects, so we don't all do the same thing, so I don't get to go, which I'm very sad about. But one of the things that I really enjoy about the classwork project is a lot of our workshops tend to work with other campaigns or other political groups, and like it's not just us who are doing a kind of a learning or at all. Like we're often like really kind of unpacking a lot of their work and like doing case studies on their work and really thinking about what they're doing. And so like we're often like, so there's this really intense cross-pollination that happens between other organisations, and it's been so exciting just being able to run, well, the pandemic kind of stopped that a little bit, but before that being able to run up and down the UK talking to different kinds of people, and like because we specifically focus on like talking to people who are marginalised, we do get to do that, and like there's been so many organisations that I've been part of, or like political groups that I've been part of, where we were just preaching to the choir. Like we were just talking to like other people who look like us, or other people who are just the same, and so like it could be better. Like I'm often thinking about outreach too. Like how do you include people into your space? Like kind of have to unpack that a little bit, because it's not about including people. It's about like opening things out and allowing people to participate in whatever they want to do, and you kind of like approach, you know, you participate with what they're doing. So yeah, like I really enjoyed that with classwork.
Thank you. I would say Hannah and June, I've recently only just met them, and I'm thinking, yeah, probably there's a scope for us working together there somehow. And I have worked with Guppy, with migrant organized through Guppy, because they are much more established, and sometimes there are things that we are trying to do, so we usually go to them for advice. Like one of the things that holds mental health within our client group is the lack of legal support, because they don't get any legal advice. So we're trying to work out how we can fundraise for that, because once you don't have legal advice and you cannot like further or submit your immigration application, you really need that, because you don't, the kind of language that's needed for the form, you really need an immigration solicitor, and if you can't pay for it, it makes it, then you will live in limbo forever. You can't submit anything. So those are the kind of things that we then reach out to migrant organized to say, oh, how do you guys do it? We're trying to do this. So we work together in that manner.
And I also thought of another thing, because the first thing I said, I don't know, I kind of left my body in that moment, and now I'm back. And so at Decolonising Economics, one of the really big things that we're into thinking about is like the infrastructure that's needed to support our movements, because I think when we think, yeah, there's so many like resources that lots of our communities need in order to be able to do what they need, like bank accounts or like, you know, access to different like training. Like there's so many infrastructural needs that our communities need, and me and Guppy are huge infrastructure nerds. So one of the things that we try and do with the collectives and the communities that we work with is kind of find where everything is. Like, where's there a free space? Who has like money to like give to a group? Who knows who can do X, Y, Z? And we try and connect those people to our ecosystem. And I think like at the moment we're setting up this co-op program. So it's like a BPOC, Black and POC community program where we're going to be like in a process of like learning with people about how to set up their own cooperatives and like the types of like resources and skills and tools that you need. And it's interesting because we're like reaching out to lots of different groups in our communities, people who work in healthcare, people who work in housing, people who work in art, right? And like trying to make the connections between economics and so many other forms of practices and ideas resource so that we can cross-pollinate. Thank you. Is there another question? Yeah.
Thanks. I feel like yours is really easy. So you want to go first?
I just really like this book, and I wonder if to send to a community to say that I don't believe in that economics for the largest non-Nonhlanhla corporations. You can ask the question and I'll just take a picture. Multitasking.
Yeah, thanks so much everyone, that was like, yeah, amazing. I think my question was kind of, and I kind of touched on it a little bit, but I was wondering what your thoughts were on kind of tactics, narratives and framing for global solidarity, and how we can relate the struggles of people who are economically excluded and depressed in places like the UK with people across kind of like global supply chains and global economy in different countries. So yeah, I was just curious to hear what your thoughts were on that. Thanks.
I think with the people that I support, I think I mentioned this earlier, most of them traveled to the UK to seek sanctuary because organizations in the north have gone back into their countries and grabbed land. They've been moved where they are promised. The justification is, if we move you, we take this land, we are going to build schools, we are going to build hospital, we are going to come up with a lot of development, and we are going to create jobs for you. And when that doesn't happen, and people get angry and they start asking the authorities, then there's this friction that's created, where then that individual is identified as an enemy of progress, and the authorities want to silence them. People are killed, they run to the UK, and when they get to the UK, they meet with the hostile environment. So it's just an ongoing situation where they are still suffering. It's a lose-lose situation. You're in your own home challenging the very organizations that created this situation. You run to them, they still won't help you, they want you to go back home. I don't know if I've answered your question.
I don't know what to say.
I think, you know what, I actually think it's really hard to kind of like create global solidarity because of kind of what we're saying about like lack of resources and like kind of already doing focused work and not really being able to support the people that you're ready to do the work for. So it's like that makes it harder to even like expand that. So, you know, with like the trans healthcare fund that we have, like our waiting list is like wild. So like the idea of even like trying to, you know, expand that is like, yeah, kind of unimaginable right now, which is like really sad. But I think I hate to be like one of those people who's just like, social media allows for, you know, a global connection that we didn't have before. And I think we definitely saw that when we were doing the Hardship Fund in like 2020, part of our as part of our fundraising, we did like a 24-hour like global Zoom raid, which was really fun. Although, yeah, Zoom raids were also like a dark time. I was just like, we're all lying to ourselves about having fun. No, but it was cute. But basically, as part of this, we worked with like 24 like black and brown DJs from like across the world, and you know, people, and to do that, we kind of, you know, seeked knowledge from a Cutie Pop collective in the US that was doing that work. We, you know, programmed DJs from, yeah, kind of like across the globe, from like those DJs from Uganda, from Malaysia, the Dominican Republic, so, and even, so that was a case of like, you know, us using our connections to try and obviously give them exposure, but also kind of like, also just like spamming the PayPal across like our social media and across like the Zoom chat, which is like, you know, something. And it's like, it was the case of like, you know, having a shared identity and being like, let's try and support each other, and like they DJ'd for us and we tried to give them money. Yeah, so I think like, yeah, I think like that's the only thing that I can think of that we kind of did. And then I guess, yeah, like knowledge, as I was saying earlier, kind of like sharing knowledge and like with like other communities that are doing the same work. Yeah, I think it's like this idea that you're the only one doing this work is like delusional. And I think like seeking knowledge from other people that are doing it in other places and sharing the knowledge that you have towards them is like a fab way of doing kind of like global solidarity stuff.
For me, I think that kind of work, I think a lot about the ways in which people in the African diaspora have found ways of like resisting forms of capitalism, and it actually started from me just kind of speaking to my aunties, and then they would connect me to their friends, and then I would go to Zimbabwe, and then I would speak to these uncles who were telling me about like the ways in which they farm, or the ways in which, you know, they're like dealing with those like seed taxes. And I worked with one of my, I mean, he's not my uncle, but one of my uncles, who's like my aunt's friend, who's like he plants like native fruit, in Zimbabwe, because there's this huge push to like take away all forms of like native food and like make it impossible to grow your own indigenous food. And so it's been really interesting for me, like that internationalist work is kind of seeing ways in which the same things happen here, but also happen in like the global south. And I recently took part in this research it's called like Africans in the Diaspora, and they were kind of putting together a list of different economic practices from people in the diaspora. And it was really interesting. There were people from who were like Latin American, who were like talking about the ways in which, you know, from birth to death, how they look after people who are been born and how they help people die, and they think of that as an economic practice. And that can also be still extended to here in the UK, because a lot of women of colour, like especially black women, work in the NHS and do a lot of that care work, right? And so for me, I find that internationalist work really important in terms of being able to further understand the mechanisms of the capitalist system, and to think about, there's just the variety of different ways in which people are doing the work that we're doing. And also one thing that I found from like connecting to people in the African diaspora, we have lots of different words for the same practices, right? So, you know, earlier I was talking to my grandmother who was into, we didn't call it a cooperative then, but it was like a burial society. So it helps people, because in Zimbabwe, like at that time, there was a huge population dying from AIDS. So what they did, they had these burial societies where communities would come together and like pool money to be able to bury people, because it was so expensive. And then in South Africa, that's another practice, but it's called something else. And then I spoke to my friends from the Caribbean who were saying how there's partner, and that's also the same thing. So like that's something that's been really helpful for me in terms of just recognizing that we're using different words, but we're talking about the same thing, and that would not be possible without speaking to people from across the world to kind of see, those practices that we're using. So I'm not sure whether to do our last question or to take another question, because we're a bit running over. Does anyone have a burning question? Or it's 31, I don't know. I'm indulgent. Have one more question, go on.
I guess it kind of came up a few times, like this idea of subverting capitalism and this like rich leftist tradition, and let's not forget before that like a pre-colonial and an indigenous tradition of alternative economies, and especially like returning to the local, which has a particular significance today because of the potential it has with regards to sustainability and climate. I guess like my question is, how do you view this idea of alternative economies versus mass mobilizations, like for example the Green New Deal, which obviously is about climate but also aims to empower people and provide like sustainable jobs? Do you see like it as sort of a one way or another, and you know, this is the way, or do you see them as like complementary? I guess that my question is, what are your opinions on sort of a mass mobilization and kind of state-centered change versus alternative economies and subverting state and capitalism?
I can say, because for me it doesn't feel like an either or, right? And I feel like for those alternative economic systems to seem like an either or makes me think more about, you know, what is it at? Because I feel like with mass mobilizations, people like those on the margins have to take a lot of concessions in order for everyone to suddenly realize that things that poor people need are important, right? And so for it to be a mass, it means that some of us have to shut up about stuff, some of us have to put up with people being dickheads to us, and some of us have to be told that the change that we're seeking is not realistic. And I remember when me and Guppy first started Decolonising Economics, we'd hear a lot from like the lefty economic people being like, well, race isn't as important right now, it's about class. And also, you know, things around like the ecological crisis, right? So me and Guppy will be like, climate change is directly related to colonialism, and people will be like, actually, no, it's not. It's nature. I don't know, it's, you know, extraction, but like those models of extraction happen because of colonialism. And I feel like lots of mass mobilizations just come with a lot of concessions, because I just feel like as a person with power, it should be, as a white person, as a middle class person, it's very simple as to where things are wrong and unjust. So why would we need, like, why do you need to be mass mobilized? I think is the question that I might, go back, but yeah.
I feel like there's this belief that like, oh, things take a long time to change, and you know, it's really hard for like massive change to happen, like something like an alternative economy. But I actually, don't really believe in that. And I think actually like COVID really showed that, because like from one day to the other, you know, our entire system like changed so drastically. Things like furlough were introduced like really quickly, things like that. And it was just like, damn, so things can actually activate really quickly if we need to and if you want to. And there is the resources to do that. And so that's why I'm kind of like, I think we are put in a position of scarcity by the system, and we are used to it, which is why, you know, we keep voting for the Tories and stuff like that, because like we believe that like, oh, scarcity is like the way to be, and I think that's like, you know, wild and sad. But also I don't, So to answer your question, I think like probably the two things need to happen hand in hand. Like you need to have, you know, systemic change, and then you also need to have like collective organizing that does provide these alternatives. But I think actually you could also just have like, you know, these alternative economies literally taking over. But it would have to be like a society-wide willingness to do that. And I think like we're not there, sadly.
So I was going to keep the last question, but then we should just, answer that one and then I'll do the last question.
I mean, you both said those exactly what I wanted to say, but more eloquently. So I don't really know what to add other than, like how I see the future, how I see democracy is by slowly becoming this all-powerful and horizontal and beautiful thing that then completely makes the state redundant, right? Like that's what I would prefer. But like whilst that's not happening, or whilst we're slowly trying to build to that point, we do have to work. It would be a privilege to say that we don't need the state right now. It would, like, you know, for people to survive, for people to kind of get through one day to the next, we have to like work with the state, and we have to work with things like the Green New Deal. So yeah, I mean, like both things have to happen right now. I wish they didn't.
You're all right.
So, we've talked about a lot of stuff, haven't we? There's a lot of things to process after today. But I'm just going to like wrap us up a little bit by I don't know how to do it. Sorry, I'm just trying to do the maths in my head of how to organize this. So, I'm maybe gonna ask for like closing remarks from the speakers, but then I kind of want you to think about like, what are your dreams for the, what are your dreams for how we get to nourishment, care, reciprocity, and like building that as like the key part of the economy. So what are your dreams, and just, in summary. Maybe let's do it different. Last first.
Yes.
The first would be last.
I'll always come last, but it's okay. I think my dream is to just see everyone reach their full potential, given the opportunity to reach their full potential. My dream is to see asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants get into jobs, get into education, inspire their children to do better, and just live their lives to the fullest. We do have asylum seekers who are GPs, medical doctors, accountants, lawyers, solicitors. We do have a lot of qualified people who are just languishing on the streets simply because they lack the piece of paper. I want to see them given jobs. I want to see them allowed to work and not depend on the government on the £35 per week, which is not enough after all, and be told from there to there about the £35 a week. They can work, they can earn their own money, they can contribute to taxes and live happily. And let's just become one big happy community That's my dream.
That's my dream too. That would be nice. Yeah, I don't know. Like I can't like see too far into the future. I mean, like, you know, it breaks my heart every day to know that like my brother like works night shifts 6 days a week and barely gets any money to afford food. You know, like my brother is really poor. Like we both were raised really poor, and he still is. And the same with my mother. And like it would make me so happy, and it would make me feel so good just to see my brother have a little bit of time just to think about other things, like think about like maybe going back to school again, or like taking up a hobby, like learning how to cook, like all of these things that other people, like people with power take for granted, like the amount of time and resources they have. And I want to see those resources shared to a point where people can actually, like as you said, like reach their full potential. And it's only then when we can do that we can start actually having a caring and democratic society, right?
Yeah, I think like I think we've gotten used to not having like autonomy and freedom, and I think that's like the one thing that I would want. So I think like what I said at the beginning about like, oh, people are threatened by like trans liberation and the possibilities that it offers is, you know, the fact that we are, you know, rejecting the system that was put upon us that is like gender, and being like, I'm gonna take autonomy over this. And it's like, I love the idea of like also doing that in like a playful way, and like, and being like, I am gonna like play with my body and like, you know, take estrogen and like play with it and like, and stop if I want to and go back to it. And like, I love this idea of just like, why shouldn't I be able to do that? And I think actually, you know, trans liberation and like wealth redistribution and like racial justice and all of these things are, yeah, threatening because of like the possibilities that they offer, and the possibilities of like freedom that they offer, and the possibilities of like equality that they offer. And I think like people at the power are really like shook by that. And what I was saying earlier on, like, oh, you know, we've gotten used to living in scarcity. I think that actually also comes with like the position in power. Like, you know what I mean? I look at these men who like have all this money and all this power and all of these properties, and I think they're like deeply unhappy and like they're deeply lonely, and I'm just like, whoa. And it's like, these things would benefit you as well. You would live like a much happier life if you like leaned into these politics and leaned into like these possibilities. Yeah, but they've convinced themselves of otherwise. So yeah, I think, what was the question? What are my dreams? My dreams are yeah, I think just for like a society where like, you know, kind of as we were saying, people live in like communion a lot more easily. We are allowed to have fun. I think it's just like we live in a society where it's like, even the idea of fun is like frowned upon, and it's like you work hard to then like be allowed to like have a bit of fun. And it's like, why shouldn't fun be like, this is silly. I'm just saying about that, but it's true. More fun, more freedom.
I agree. And maybe, yeah, that's on freedom and fun. Thank you so much to everyone who's come today, and thank you so much to the wonderful people at TWT who've organised this panel. It's been great. Shout out to Almadeep for their amazing thoughts and just the ways in which they organise. And just side note, if you want to donate to Decolonising Economics, you can. We're fundraising for BPOC co-operative learning program. It's a mouthful. Go on our Twitter, Decolonising E. Go on our website, Decolonising Economics, and you'll find ways to donate. Thank you so much. Have a good day.